19-year-old dog refuses to eat until she hears a familiar voice. At Harmony Animal Rescue, the late afternoon sunlight spilled through the large kennel windows, casting golden hues across the worn-out floors. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of barking dogs, some eager for attention, others simply singing the chorus of a life in transition. But inside the private medical wing, where the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm blankets, there was only quiet. Daisy lay curled on her bed, a thick, orthopedic cushion that had become her resting place over the past few weeks. Her once vibrant golden coat, now faded and thin in places, barely rose with each slow breath. The rhythmic hum of the heater in the corner did little to warm the heavy sense of sorrow in the room. She had stopped eating 3 days ago. It wasn't sudden. The decline had been coming for a while. She moved slower, slept longer, ate less. The inevitable march of time was catching up with her, and the staff knew it. Still, no one wanted to admit that they were witnessing the final days of the most remarkable dog to ever walk through Harmony's doors. Daisy wasn't just another rescue. She was a legend. She had arrived nearly 2 decades ago, a neglected puppy with ribs poking through her matted fur, terrified of human hands. Time had transformed her into something extraordinary. She had raised countless abandoned litters as if they were her own, had calmed even the most frightened dogs with her quiet, patient presence. She had been the bridge between traumatized animals and their second chance at happiness. And now she was fading. Linda, the rescue's senior caretaker, sat beside Daisy's bed, running a gentle hand over her thinning fur. She had been there the day Daisy arrived all those years ago, a trembling, malnourished pup barely able to stand, and she had been there for every milestone since. Now, as she watched Daisy's half-lidded eyes flicker in some restless dream, she felt a lump form in her throat. "You don't have to fight anymore, sweetheart," Linda whispered, her voice thick. "But if you want to, we'll be right here." Outside, the rest of the staff carried on with their daily routines, but there was an undeniable weight pressing down on everyone. The atmosphere at Harmony had shifted. Even the dogs seemed to feel it. Some whined at their gates, others paced their enclosures uneasily. They had seen their matriarch's strength wane, and the pack understood in a way that humans never quite could. Daisy had been the heart of this place for so long. What would Harmony be without her? A few miles away, a man sat in his quiet study, staring at his phone. Dr. James Carter had spent years in the field of canine behavioral studies, dedicating his career to understanding the emotional lives of rescued dogs. He had published papers, led seminars, and consulted on groundbreaking research. But before all of that, before the degrees and accolades, there had been Daisy. He had first met her in 2011 when he began his research at Harmony. At the time, he had been skeptical that a single dog could play such a pivotal role in stabilizing others. But Daisy had proven him wrong. She had been his test subject, his colleague, and eventually his best friend. He had studied her interactions, marveled at her instincts, and built entire theories around the quiet magic she worked on other animals. And in return, she had trusted him. James had retired last year, trading the demands of academia for a quieter life in the mountains. He still kept in touch with Harmony, but he hadn't visited in months. Now, as he scrolled through Linda's message, "Daisy isn't doing well. We thought you should know." Something inside him ached. He knew what the message meant. It wasn't just an update, it was a goodbye. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and keys, his heart hammering as he headed for the door. He had spent his life studying canine memory, and if there was one thing he believed with absolute certainty, it was that Daisy would remember him. The drive to Harmony felt longer than usual. His hands gripped the wheel tighter than necessary as he replayed old memories. Daisy curled beside him during late-night research sessions, her steady presence grounding him as he scribbled notes. The way she used to nudge his arm when he worked too long without a break. The way her amber eyes had seemed to hold entire conversations without ever needing words. By the time he arrived, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the familiar brick building. He didn't wait to check in at the front desk. The staff recognized him immediately, their eyes filled with the same quiet sadness he felt. No one tried to stop him as he strode toward the medical wing. The room was dimly lit when he stepped inside. Linda glanced up from her place beside Daisy, and offered him a small, knowing smile. "She's been waiting," she murmured. James swallowed the lump in his throat as he knelt beside the old dog. "Hey, Daisy," he said softly, his voice trembling. Daisy didn't move. Her breathing was shallow, her body still. For a terrible moment, he thought he had come too late. Desperate, he did the only thing he could think of. He hummed. It was a simple tune, an old folk melody he used to sing absent-mindedly while working late nights at Harmony. Daisy had always responded to it, lifting her head, wagging her tail, as if comforted by the sound. Now, as the soft hum filled the room, James held his breath, willing her to hear it. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a twitch, a faint, barely perceptible flick of her ear. James sucked in a sharp breath. "Daisy," he whispered, his fingers gently brushing against her paw. Slowly, achingly, her eyes opened. They were duller than before, clouded with time, but they still held recognition. She met his gaze, and in that moment, the years melted away. A weak, almost imperceptible wag of her tail. James let out a choked laugh, tears spilling freely now. He took her paw in his hand, pressing his forehead against her warm fur. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm here, Daisy." Behind him, Linda wiped at her own eyes, a small, disbelieving smile spreading across her face. The staff, who had been watching from the hallway, exchanged glances of quiet astonishment. For the first time in days, there was hope. James stayed by Daisy's side long after the initial rush of emotion settled, his hand never leaving her paw. The warmth of her fur was faint but steady, a fragile connection to a life that had always burned so brightly. The staff at Harmony moved around them in hushed tones, their usual efficiency tempered by the weight of the moment. No one wanted to disturb them, as if speaking too loudly might break the delicate tether holding Daisy to the world. Linda brought a soft blanket, draping it over Daisy's frail body, and James whispered his thanks. He barely noticed the passing of time, only aware of the rhythmic rise and fall of Daisy's breathing and the occasional flicker of recognition in her eyes. He kept humming, sometimes speaking softly between verses, recalling old stories, moments they had shared. The way she used to nudge his leg when he had forgotten to take a break from work. "Do you remember that, Daisy?" he murmured. "You always knew better than me, didn't you?" Her eyelids fluttered, and though she didn't have the strength to move much, he swore he saw the faintest shift of her paw, a response as familiar as breathing. Hours passed like that, James lost in the quiet presence of the dog who had shaped his life. He felt the ache of time pressing against them, the bittersweet knowledge that no matter how tightly he held on, their time together was slipping away. But there was also something else, something unexpected, a spark, a resilience he had seen in Daisy countless times before, in the way she had mothered every lost and frightened dog that had passed through Harmony's doors, in the way she had carried her own past scars with quiet dignity. The fact that she had recognized him, responded to his voice, meant something. The Daisy he knew had always fought for those she loved. Could she fight for herself now? The next morning, the air inside the rescue felt different, subtle but undeniable. The other dogs, who had been restless in the days leading up to Daisy's decline, seemed calmer. Some of the younger ones, the more anxious rescues, had been unsettled by the shift in the pack's balance, sensing the absence of their matriarch's guiding presence. But now, as James stepped out of the medical wing for the first time since his arrival, he noticed the change. The dogs weren't whining or pacing as much. Some lay curled in their beds, others pressed their noses against the kennel doors, watching with quiet curiosity. It was as if they too had felt the flicker of hope in the night. James stretched, feeling the stiffness in his joints from sitting on the floor for so long. Linda approached, holding 2 cups of coffee, her expression cautious but not entirely devoid of optimism. "How is she?" she asked, handing him a cup. "Still weak," James admitted, rubbing his face. "But she knew me. She heard the song." Linda's eyes softened, and she nodded. She always did love that song. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, sipping their coffee, watching as the rescue began its morning routine. Volunteers arrived, greeting the dogs with the practiced ease of those who had spent years mending broken spirits. The smell of fresh kibble filled the air, and the rhythmic clatter of food bowls being set down echoed through the hall. Life moved forward as it always did, but there was an unspoken understanding among the staff now. Daisy was still here, and as long as she was, they would cherish every moment. James returned to Daisy's side, speaking to her in soft tones as he ran a gentle hand over her fur. "Do you remember our first research session?" He chuckled quietly. "You were supposed to be a test subject, but you ended up teaching me more than I ever taught you." He recalled those early days when he had first started his behavioral studies, unsure if rescued dogs could ever truly recover from their past. Daisy had shattered his doubts. She had shown him how empathy, patience, and trust could rebuild what had once been broken. "You changed everything, you know," he murmured. "Not just for the dogs here, but for me too." It was then that he noticed something odd. Near the edge of her bed, nestled beneath the folds of the blanket, was a small pile of uneaten kibble. At first he thought someone had spilled it accidentally, but as he reached for it, a realization struck him. Daisy had been stashing food. Despite her frail state, despite her dwindling appetite, she had been hiding small portions, tucking them away in secret. James felt a lump form in his throat as he brushed his fingers over the carefully placed pieces. It was an instinct, one he had seen before in rescued dogs who had known hunger, who had learned to prepare for the worst. But it was also something else. It was survival, a sign that somewhere deep inside, Daisy wasn't ready to give up just yet. He turned to Linda, holding up the small collection of kibble. "She's been saving this," he said, voice thick with emotion. Linda blinked, then let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "Of course she has," she murmured. "That's Daisy for you." That afternoon, James tried offering her small bites of food, speaking to her in the same gentle, reassuring tone he had always used. At first, there was no response. But then, after a long pause, she sniffed the kibble, her nose twitching ever so slightly. James held his breath, and then, with a weak but deliberate movement, she took a small, hesitant bite. It wasn't much, just a nibble, barely more than a token gesture. But it was enough. The staff who had been watching from the hallway erupted into soft cheers, their faces alight with cautious joy. Even the dogs seemed to react, a few barking excitedly from their kennels, tails wagging as if sensing the shift in energy. Linda clapped a hand over her mouth, eyes shining. "She's trying," she whispered. James exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that felt like releasing days of tension all at once. "She's not done yet," he said, his voice steadier now. That night, as the rescue quieted and the dogs settled into sleep, James remained beside Daisy, humming softly once more. She drifted in and out of rest, her breathing still slow, still fragile. But there was something in the way her body curled ever so slightly closer to him, something in the way her ears twitched at the familiar melody. Hope was a fragile thing, but sometimes it was enough. The quiet hum of the night surrounded them, a rhythmic silence interrupted only by the slow, steady breathing of the sleeping dogs. Harmony Animal Rescue had settled into its usual lull, the occasional shuffle of paws against kennel floors, the distant sigh of wind through the trees. James sat cross-legged beside Daisy's bed, his fingers idly stroking the soft fur behind her ear. It was thinner than he remembered, her once thick golden coat now streaked with silver, a testament to the years she had carried with grace. He had stayed at her side the entire day, and when the rescue staff had urged him to get some rest, he had simply shaken his head. He couldn't leave her now, not when he had finally seen the flicker of something familiar in her eyes, that quiet determination that had always defined her. The small stash of kibble she had hoarded lay beside him, a symbol of her resilience. Even in weakness, she had prepared, a dog who had spent her life ensuring others were safe before thinking of herself. It wasn't just survival, it was instinct, an unshakable part of who she was. James sighed, rubbing his eyes. "You're still looking out for everyone, aren't you?" he murmured, his voice just above a whisper. Daisy's ears twitched slightly, and though she remained curled in her bed, there was an awareness in her stillness. He reached for a soft biscuit from the bowl Linda had left earlier, breaking off a small piece. "Come on, girl," he coaxed gently. "Just a little more." He placed the treat near her nose, and for a long moment, she didn't move. Then slowly she lifted her head just enough to sniff it, her dry nose twitching, as if considering. James held his breath. Another moment passed before her tongue flicked out, catching the edge of the biscuit and pulling it into her mouth. It was slow, hesitant, but she ate it. James exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was something, a small victory. Around him, the air in the rescue felt different, lighter somehow. He wasn't sure if the other staff members had felt it too, but he had seen the way the other dogs reacted to Daisy's small improvement, the way their restless energy had calmed, the way their eyes followed him as he moved through the space. Dogs had a way of knowing. They sensed things humans never could, understood bonds in ways that science had only begun to explore. Daisy had always been their center, their quiet leader, the heartbeat of harmony, and even now, in the fragile space between staying and leaving, she was holding them together. The next morning, Linda found James still beside Daisy's bed, his back pressed against the wall, his chin resting on his chest. He had dozed off sometime before dawn, exhaustion catching up with him despite his best efforts. She didn't wake him. Instead, she crouched beside Daisy, running a gentle hand down her back. To her surprise, the old retriever's eyes fluttered open, slower than usual but clearer than the night before. "Hey, old girl," she murmured, her lips curving into a soft smile. Daisy blinked up at her, then turned her head just slightly, searching. Linda followed her gaze. She wasn't looking at her. She was looking at James. A lump formed in Linda's throat. "You waited for him, didn't you?" she whispered. Daisy didn't move, but something in her expression answered for her. She had held on for this. For him. Linda reached for one of the smaller bowls of food, scooping a tiny bit of softened kibble onto her fingers. "Let's try this," she said quietly, offering it near Daisy's nose. The retriever sniffed once, then hesitated. But when James stirred beside her, blinking awake and rubbing his eyes, Daisy licked the food off Linda's fingers without a second thought. James blinked, still groggy. Then he saw what had happened. "She ate?" His voice was thick, rough from sleep. Linda nodded, unable to keep the smile from her face. "She ate." By afternoon, Daisy had managed a few more bites. She was still weak, her movements slow, but the shift in her spirit was undeniable. She was trying. James spent the hours between feeding her and simply sitting with her, recounting old stories she couldn't respond to, but still seemed to hear. The other dogs had gathered closer to her section of the rescue, pressing against the kennel doors, watching in quiet reverence. It was as if they too knew this was something sacred. But then something strange happened. James had stepped out for just a moment, stretching his legs and refilling his coffee, when he noticed a commotion near the back of the rescue. A few of the more nervous dogs had begun pacing, their tails flicking uncertainly. He followed their line of sight and saw it. One of the younger rescues, a wiry shepherd mix named Theo, was digging frantically near his bed, pushing blankets aside with desperate movements. At first, James thought he was just being restless, but then another dog joined in, and another. Within minutes, 3 or 4 dogs had started doing the same, rummaging through their spaces as if searching for something. James frowned, stepping closer. "What's going on?" Linda appeared at his side, watching the dogs with equal confusion. Then, as if on cue, Theo stopped digging and pulled something from beneath his blanket, a single untouched biscuit. James and Linda exchanged a glance. Then they turned, watching as the other dogs began doing the same, pulling out hidden bits of food from corners of their enclosures, places where they had stashed treats and kibble long ago. James's breath caught. "They're copying her." Linda blinked, taking a step back. "Daisy's food stash," she whispered. "They must have seen her do it." One by one, the dogs took their hidden treasures and carried them toward Daisy's section of the rescue. Their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. They didn't drop them near her bed, but they left them just outside, as if offering them to the space she occupied, as if paying respect. Even the youngest rescues, the ones who had never been directly guided by her, participated. James felt something tighten in his chest. She taught them, he murmured. She taught them all this time, and we never realized. Daisy, still too weak to move much, lifted her head ever so slightly, watching as the dogs placed their offerings. Her tail, just barely visible beneath the blanket, gave the smallest wag. James knelt beside her, his voice barely above a whisper. "You did it," he said. "You took care of them, even when we didn't see it." Linda wiped at her eyes, unable to contain the overwhelming emotion of the moment. Around them, the energy in the rescue shifted again. But this time it wasn't somber. It was reverence, respect, a final lesson from a dog who had given everything she had to those who needed it most. That night, James stayed by Daisy's side once more, humming softly as she drifted in and out of sleep. The other dogs lay close to their gates, the rescued mirroring their rescuer, their quiet presence a tribute to the golden heart that had led them all. Daisy had always been their light, their silent guardian. And even now, in the twilight of her time, she was teaching them what it meant to love, to care, to prepare for the future, even when your own path was nearing its end. James pressed his forehead against her fur, his voice trembling. "Rest easy, Daisy," he whispered. "You've done more than enough." The rescue was different now, though no one had said it aloud. It wasn't just the people who felt it. The air had changed, the energy within Harmony itself shifting with an unspoken reverence. Daisy was still here, still fighting, still wrapped in the warmth of blankets and the steady presence of James. But there was an unshakable understanding that the final chapter was unfolding. Even the dogs knew. They no longer whined restlessly in their kennels, no longer paced with uncertainty. Instead, they watched, waiting, honoring something instinctively, something greater than them all. James hadn't left her side. He barely noticed the passing days, the way the light stretched long in the mornings and dwindled softly in the evenings. He only knew the rise and fall of Daisy's breath, the occasional flicker of her eyes when he spoke, the ever-so-slight movement of her tail when he hummed their song. He spoke to her about everything and nothing, recalling the early days when she had first arrived, the way she had pressed herself into the corner of her kennel, too afraid to be touched. He told her how she had been his greatest lesson, how she had taught him more than any research paper or study ever could. He told her about his retirement, about how he had tried to live a quiet life, but had always felt something missing. "I think it was you," he murmured, stroking her fur. "I think I was always supposed to come back to you." She hadn't eaten again since that small, tentative bite, but James hadn't expected her to. The effort had been for him, he knew that now. She had given him that moment, had let him believe, for just a little while longer, that they had more time. But time was slipping away, and Daisy, wise as she was, had made peace with it. The other dogs sensed it too, their quiet offerings still left untouched outside her enclosure. It was as if they had all come to an agreement, a silent promise to hold the space for her, to let her go when she was ready. Linda had started spending more time sitting with them, not saying much, just existing in the same space. Her presence another tether keeping Daisy connected to the world. The other staff members would pass by, some pausing to stroke Daisy's head, some whispering soft thanks as if she could take their gratitude with her when she left. No one had ever seen a dog mourned like this, honored like this, but no one questioned it either. Daisy wasn't just another dog. She was the foundation, the quiet force that had shaped Harmony into what it was. That evening, as the sky turned a soft orange, James felt something shift. Daisy stirred, not much, just a small, deliberate movement, and her tired eyes opened fully for the first time in hours. She looked at him, really looked at him, and James felt his throat tighten. "Hey, sweetheart," he whispered, reaching for her paw. "I'm right here." For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind outside, the distant rustle of leaves against the kennel walls. Then Daisy moved again, a slow, shaky stretch, her nose brushing against his wrist. James sucked in a sharp breath. "Do you want to go outside?" he asked, though he wasn't sure if she had the strength. But Daisy, ever determined, made the choice for him. With great effort she shifted, her legs weak beneath her body trembling as she tried to stand. James moved quickly, supporting her, his hands gentle but firm as he helped ease her onto her paws. Linda, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward without a word, her hands reaching to steady Daisy as well. Together, they guided her out of the medical wing, past the rows of watching dogs, past the quiet reverence that filled every corner of the rescue. The cool evening air wrapped around them as they stepped outside. The sky was painted in soft strokes of pink and gold, the fading sunlight casting a gentle glow over the fields beyond the rescue. Daisy took a slow, measured step forward, her body weak but her spirit unyielding. James crouched beside her, his hand still resting against her side. "Look at that," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You made it to another sunset." Daisy lifted her head, her nose twitching as she breathed in the familiar sense of the place she had called home for so long. She stood there for what felt like forever, the quiet settling over them like a blanket. Linda knelt beside James, her own eyes damp. "She just wanted to see it one more time," she murmured. James swallowed hard. "Yeah," he whispered. "She did." Daisy's legs trembled, and James was there in an instant, easing her back down onto the soft grass. She didn't resist. She settled into him, her body pressed against his, her breathing slow and steady. He stroked her fur, his fingers tracing the familiar patterns, memorizing every detail. The other dogs had gathered at the edge of the kennels, some standing, some lying down, all watching. They didn't whine, didn't bark. They simply bore witness. Daisy let out a deep, content sigh, her body relaxing fully against James. He felt her weight, felt the warmth of her pressed into him, felt the quiet understanding pass between them. He kept humming, the same soft melody, the same song that had carried them through so many years. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Daisy's breathing grew slower, softer. James felt the moment she let go. There was no struggle, no pain, just a quiet exhale, a peaceful surrender into the night. James stayed like that for a long time, his forehead pressed against hers, his fingers still running through her fur. Linda didn't move either, silent tears tracing down her cheeks. The other dogs remained at their places, watching, waiting. And then, as if the world itself had felt the shift, a breeze picked up, gentle and warm, rustling the leaves and carrying with it the quiet echoes of a life well lived. "She's gone," Linda whispered, her voice breaking. James nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The rescue was silent, but it was not the silence of grief. It was the silence of gratitude, of honor, of love. Daisy had not left them in darkness. She had left them in light. James pressed one last kiss to the top of her head, his tears soaking into her fur. "Thank you, Daisy," he whispered, "for everything." And as the stars blinked to life above them, the rescue, her rescue, stood still, holding space for the dog who had given them all so much. The rescue felt different in the days that followed. It wasn't an emptiness, though Daisy's absence was felt in every quiet corner, in every lingering glance toward the place where she had once laid. It was something softer, something settled, as if the air itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled in peace. The dogs had returned to their usual rhythms, but there was a change in them too, a calmness that hadn't been there before. It was as if they had been given permission to move forward, to carry on with the lessons their matriarch had left behind. They no longer paced with unease, no longer whined at the loss of their leader. Instead, they found comfort in one another, in the bonds Daisy had nurtured. She had spent her life teaching them how to be more than just survivors. Now they lived as proof of that. James remained at Harmony longer than he had planned. He had come expecting to say goodbye, to mourn, to hold Daisy's paw through the final moments of her journey. But what he hadn't expected was how hard it would be to leave. He found himself falling into old habits, waking up early to help with feedings, assisting with new intakes, sitting beside nervous rescues who needed someone to remind them that humans could be kind. It wasn't work, it was muscle memory. It was breathing. It was everything Daisy had been trying to teach him all these years, even when he thought he had been the one guiding her. Linda watched him with knowing eyes but never said much. She let him find his own pace, let him linger in the places Daisy had loved most. One evening, as they closed up for the night, she finally broke the silence that had stretched between them since Daisy's passing. "She wouldn't want you to leave," she said simply, wiping her hands on a rag as she leaned against the doorframe of the medical wing. James looked up from where he had been sitting, staring absently at Daisy's empty bed. He let out a small, tired laugh. I know, he admitted. I can hear her in my head, nudging me like she used to, telling me to get up, to do something. Linda smiled, nodding toward the rescue floor, where the other dogs had begun settling in for the night. Then do something, she said. Stay. James didn't answer right away. He had spent so much of his life moving forward, always pushing toward the next chapter, always chasing answers. But Daisy had never been like that. She had always been steady, always grounded, always where she needed to be. Maybe it was time he finally listened. The next morning, he made his decision. He met with Linda in her small office, surrounded by walls covered in photos of dogs who had passed through Harmony's doors. Some had been adopted, their new families beaming beside them. Others had stayed, living out their days in the place that had saved them. And then there was Daisy. Her picture hung near the center, right at eye level, her wise amber eyes forever frozen in time. I want to stay, James said, the words feeling right even as they left his mouth. I don't know in what capacity yet, but I need to be here. Linda didn't look surprised. Instead, she just nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. I was hoping you'd say that, she admitted.